and announced that he had a statement that he insisted on making. And I'm going to read some of his statement out to you verbatim. As part of the British Rainbow Party Health Charter, I henceforth proclaim I've been commissioned to research the extent and causes of medical negligence. Psychiatry is a tool to commit and cover up medical negligence and also to control society and suppress freedom of thought and speech, classing mad people as sane and vice versa. Hello, cruel world. My name is Dr. Sohom Das. I'm a consultant forensic psychiatrist. I assess mentally disordered offenders for a living so that you don't have to. Today, I'm going to read extracts from my book, 𝐏𝐬𝐲𝐜𝐡, which is out on the 10th of March, 2022. My book is basically like my professional memoirs. So it's about my journey becoming a forensic psychiatrist, and it's peppered with lots of my real life cases. I've picked the most interesting and bizarre ones for my book. And I'm going to read an extract about one particular case, which I think was fascinating. It's one of the only times I've felt threatened in my career, not physically, but in terms of my reputation. You'll understand what I mean when I start reading it. Also in this episode, I'm going to answer some questions about writing my book. So I put a call out to my YouTube subscribers on my YouTube channel in the community page asking if there are any questions, and you very kindly responded, and so I'm going to answer some of those in this episode. Right, let's get started. So this is chapter 22. It's called An Inept Psychobabblist. I'm not going to read it all verbatim because it'll take too long. I'll kind of skim read and you'll understand as I'm doing it. Okay, let's start. Are you sitting comfortably? Then we shall begin. One trait that makes me thrive in my field is my ability to separate the offender from the offence, whether they have killed a family member, gravely injured a stranger, or even sexually abused a child. No matter how horrific the deed is, I consider it a separate entity from the perpetrator's psychiatric needs. Not only do I not know why I've got this ability, if you call emotional detachment an ability, but I didn't even realise until others pointed it out. And I went through some examples of my life where people have said that I'm a bit of a psychopath, really. And I've said the irony isn't lost on me that some of these features are the building blocks that I diagnose in my defendants. Antisocial personality disorder leads to callous indifference. Psychopathy involves not recognizing distress in others. Autistic spectrum disorder is associated with deficits in some areas of empathy. So I'm not proposing that I'm an antisocial psychopath who is on the spectrum, but let's just say I might share the occasional traits. Okay, so let's get on to this case. So I was driving into the solicitor's office to meet a man who I was due to assess for a criminal trial called Mr. Ralph Riley. Obviously he's changed his name. I'm not an idiot. I don't want to get sued. All the cases in my book, I've changed the names and the demographics, but the essence is 100% real. So, alarm bells should have started ringing when I read the case papers earlier that morning. Ralph was in his early 40s, same as me at the time, though he was single and lived with his father. This was all towards the end of 2019. His mother had apparently committed suicide when Ralph was a toddler. He'd received some treatment about 3 years ago for some problems in his nose, his nasal septal area, and his turbinate, which resulted in problems breathing. And basically what happened was that Ralph was not happy about the outcome. But after exhausting the usual NHS complaints procedures, he launched a campaign against doctors and the staff at the hospital. So this is when alarm bells should have started ringing. He'd written letters to the doctors individually, expressing his displeasure, claiming clinical negligence. And this is where it gets interesting. Ralph started covertly filming these doctors at various meetings and appointments. And he used the pictures in still images to make these lot of newsletters and these pamphlets. And he started calling for the execution of these doctors. So he wanted them to die. So now, as I think you'll agree, even for the layperson, we're delving into the area of mental illness. He'd been distributing these leaflets into the local area, including posting them through the mailboxes of the streets where the doctors lived. And he started causing them some distress, started damaging some reputations. He even created a website and a blog and founded the British Rainbow Party. So I've said that in inverted commas because he believes it's a political organisation. The Crown Prosecution Service says that it isn't because it's not incorporated and therefore it doesn't technically exist. So before I even saw Ralph, he'd been convicted of 2 counts of harassment without violence and 2 counts of sending communications in a threatening message. He'd received like a community order and a restraining order, but the reason I was assessing him was because at the court hearing, he'd started making these bizarre sort of statements during his trial. And rightly so, the court thought there was something wrong with his mental health, and so he was sent to me for an evaluation. And the case was overseen by a judge called Judge Whittaker, again, not her real name. So as I drove into the car park behind the solicitor's firm, so I was seeing him in his solicitor's office, I saw a man in a trench coat standing in front of the entrance. He seemed to be noting down my car registration. I assumed it was a security guard and I waved at him. He shook his head ominously and walked back into the building. So when I got into the building, I met Ralph, who was an overweight man with thinning, scraggly brown hair and huge, thick, bespectacled glass eyes, which looked like magnifying glasses, with a tape between the lenses. His elderly father was a fraction of his size and had the same beady eyes and was basically the same man that I'd seen in the car park. What I thought was weird was that the solicitor had crammed us into this old room in the downstairs of the solicitor's office, even though I knew they had newer, larger, more spacious rooms upstairs. And this room that we were sent to was a bit of a storeroom. It had like old books and tables, etc. There's a reason for that. We'll get into it. So the interview was grueling, I think is fair to say. Before I had a chance to introduce myself, Ralph stated, well, they both stated that they would refuse to cooperate unless they allowed his father to be present. And the threat was unnecessary because, like all clients, I don't mind if family members want to be present. They both chastised me for being late, even though I was actually 15 minutes early. And Ralph's father asked me if I was a doctor, and when I replied I was, all psychiatrists are doctors, not psychologists, he barked at me that this was untrue because I was a psychiatrist. And he referred to me and all other psychiatrists as inept psychobabblists. And he kept using that phrase, psychobabblist, every time he was describing a psychiatrist. That's the name of the chapter. That's how clever I am. So then they unleashed a barrage of complaints about the various doctors who had tried to treat Ralph. And basically, I kept trying to redirect the interview, and I kept trying to make it clear that I wasn't doing like a clinical negligence assessment. And I was trying to assess his mental health. But despite what I was saying, they constantly kept talking about their perceived medical maltreatment. And interestingly, they were teasing me with morsels of a wider conspiracy theory, which is what I was actually interested in because I was assessing his mental health. About 10 minutes into the interview, Ralph stood on a chair, uncrumpled a piece of paper, and announced that he had a statement that he insisted on making. And I'm going to read some of his statement out to you verbatim. As part of the British Rainbow Party Health Charter, I henceforth proclaim I've been commissioned to research the extent and causes of medical negligence. Psychiatry is a tool to commit and cover up medical negligence and also to control society and suppress freedom of thought and speech, classing mad people as sane and vice versa. As I was doing this, Ralph's father was clutching his chest, looking really proud. Ralph continued, "You and your ilk create fictional diagnoses, while true mental illnesses such as royalism and paedophilia are ignored. Henceforth, I do not recognise you or your specialty. You originate from Nazi Gestapo culture. I declare that when the British Rainbow Party comes to power, all psychobabblists such as yourself will be removed from civilised society and sectioned to a safe place. Those who will not conform will be executed, and this country will be cleansed of psychobabble. Dun dun dun. Any attempt to place me in any kind of prison will result in the following. All covert video recordings that I have not yet leaked will henceforth flood into the internet. 50,000 policy sheets with our manifesto will flood the boroughs of blah blah blah. A further 300,000 sheets will henceforth flood the relevant parts of London, exposing Judge Whittaker, who oversaw the mockery of my court case and her role in suppressing my manifesto to protect unscrupulous doctors, the judiciary and psychobabblists." And then he folded the piece of paper, peered over me with his dark eyes, and ended with the ominous phrase, "You may think surely you can hurt me, but my people and my party can hurt you far worser." So as I wrote in my book, I'm not sure what astounded me the most: the sheer paranoia between his statements, the prospect of his photocopying fees, the overuse of the term henceforth, or the reprehensible grammar. Okay, I'm going to carry on and tell you about what happened with my assessment and the conclusion, but first, just to break it up a little bit, because I'm nice like that, I'm going to answer a question from the Tinterweb from my YouTube channel about writing the book. So this question comes from Poppy Blossoms. How long did it take the idea, concept, writing, editing, finding a team, finding a publisher? Do you have writer's block? How did you get out of it? Okay, it's a lot of questions. Thank you for those questions, Poppy. So basically, in terms of the ideas and the concept, the short version is that I initially tried to write a fiction book, a novel, which was loosely based on a real-life patient of mine called Yasmin, one of my most emotional cases, a real-life 18-year-old girl who had killed her nephew, although in my book she killed her younger sister. I've got a video on Yasmin as it's one of the most emotional and shocking cases that I've personally dealt with. She was psychotic at the time, I should say. So I wrote fiction probably about 3 years ago, got a agent, and it basically flopped. No publisher wanted to pick it up, but most publishers that I spoke to told me that they were interested in what became this book, so my professional memoirs. So even though I didn't really want to write that, to be honest, because I didn't think it was that interesting or not interesting enough to write an entire book, the idea was planted in my mind. And over time, I eventually started just sort of jotting down ideas, looking at old cases, and it dawned on me pretty quickly that actually there's loads more than I thought that I could talk about. I can make this interesting. I can make this into a book. So the whole process of the ideas took maybe 2-3 months. Writing it took about a year to a year and a half. Writing the first draft really didn't take that long, maybe 3 months, but most of the time was spent redrafting, changing stories, making it chronological, etc., etc. And a big shout out to to my agent that I finally found, Katie Fulford. Hello, Katie. And to Sphere Publishing, who are a subsidiary of Little Brown Hachette, who are publishing the book. So shout out to all the staff there. So that process, it was kind of, again, probably several months for that to happen. Did I get writer's block? I don't think I got writer's block in that whenever I thought I needed to write, I could write. However, I do feel that some of my writing was substandard. It was a bit whack. So I guess what I'm saying is some people might have writer's block where they can't write anything. For me, I was constantly writing. And I think that's related to the fact that I only had very specific pockets of time to write. So as well as my YouTube channel and my NHS job and my private work as a forensic psychiatrist, which are long hours, and my family, and going to the gym most days, I had like a set time, an hour and a half to maybe 2 hours, if I'm lucky, 3 hours in a day where I can write. So I guess what I'm saying is I didn't have the luxury of being able to have writer's block. I either wrote in that time or I didn't write. But some of my writing didn't make the final cut. So I suppose as a tip to anybody that's thinking of writing a book, don't overthink whether it's good or not, just write. And in the process of writing, you will know whether it's good, whether it's bad. When you come back to edit it, you will cut out a lot. So conceptualize it like I conceptualize it. There's no such thing as writer's block. Just write, just put stuff on the page, worry about the quality later, and over time it will form in some way or another. You might have to come back many, many times, which I had to do, but it will form one way or another. Okay, right, I'm going to go back to the case and then we'll do some more questions. So you probably want to know what happened with Ralph. So I went into a lot more detail about how prickly Ralph was. He was kind of insulting. I tried to ask him questions that you would do usually in a normal psychiatric screen about his work and his symptoms, and he was very, very verbally aggressive, sometimes passively aggressive. And both Ralph and his partner seemed absolutely convinced that the British Rainbow Party would come to power and that their policies would include free CT scans for everybody. And I quote, 90% of those doctors who are crooked will be replaced by homeopaths. And as I said in my book, that might have been the craziest thing that Ralph said. Another policy, and this is kind of significant in that it's actually a criminal charge, is that anybody who killed a judge or a member of the Crown Prosecution Service would be pardoned. And he made a number of derogatory statements about Judge Whittaker. And he said, if she dares put me in prison, she will feel the wrath of my organisation. She is an immoral and illegal buffoon. If I'm incarcerated, my disciples should rise up and there will be havoc to pay. So I said that the entire interaction lasted almost 2 hours, although I'd made my diagnosis within the first few minutes of meeting Ralph. His ramblings indicated an intricate, paranoid, delusional system, I'm sure you will agree, which involved the police, the judiciary, and all doctors being in cahoots. There was a sprinkling, tiny taste of delusional grandiosity regarding his own authority, his martyrdom, and the power of his non-existent political party. Crucially, there was no indication of him or his father believing that his harassment was in any way wrong or that legal proceedings would in any way curtail his behaviour. In fact, if anything, I think the legal process had strengthened his paranoid beliefs. And there were some menacing hints of derogatory material being disseminated. So what I'm saying is I genuinely felt that there's a danger that he could ruin my reputation. So if I didn't give him a favourable report, then he would he said that he would leak lots of information about me, Judge Whittaker. So I concluded, pay attention nerds, here comes the science. I concluded that Ralph had developed a delusional disorder. So this is characterised by either a single delusion or a set of related delusions that are usually persistent and lifelong. Now, this differs from schizophrenia. If you've been watching my channel, you know what schizophrenia is. If not, I've got a video on what it is and what it isn't. But delusional disorder is different from schizophrenia because there is other psychopathology in schizophrenia, such as hearing voices. And also in delusional disorder, there's no functional or cognitive decline, which means that people who suffer with it are actually pretty intelligent and capable. Whereas in something like chronic schizophrenia, it can decrease your IQ over time. So that actually makes them more determined and more dangerous, I think, in this case. Onset is usually in the middle age, unlike schizophrenia. Okay, so now here's the unique bit of this case. This case exposed me for the first and only time in my career to folie à deux, which is a very rare and unnecessarily French psychiatric phenomenon, also known as shared psychosis. So that's when one delusional belief is transmitted from one individual to another, usually a close family member, and classically when both sufferers are isolated from society. So this is probably a mixture of shared genetic predisposition, because as you might know, psychosis runs in family, and also from being brainwashed with delusional ideas over time without any contradictory, rational voices of reason. So I thought this was quite interesting because I'd spent so much time learning about bizarre delusions during my training, like folie à deux, that it kind of felt like I was collecting them when I actually saw them in my career. If you're interested in folie à deux, I've done a video on these Swedish twins, so identical twins, completely true story, who in real life tried to kill themselves by literally running into traffic and jumping into traffic. So go check out that video. They also had folie à deux, they had the same psychosis. One of them went to hospital after she was run over by a truck, and there's actually live footage of this happening because the police, by coincidence, were being followed around by a camera crew at the time they got the call. And another one, Sabina, was relatively uninjured, which is amazing considering she was running into traffic, and she was discharged by police, which, as I said in my video, I think was an incorrect call, and she'd charmed the police officers, and she went on to kill a random stranger the next day. So shocking, horrendous case, go check it out. Okay, back to some questions, and then at the end I will tell you the outcome, the final outcome of the Ralph Wiley case. So, next question is by Lily DeJervan. Was it difficult to write creatively without over-intellectualizing? What are your aspirations in sharing these case studies to explain the mentality within forensics, to profit from your experience? Very loaded question. Or perhaps to guide us in our own possibly related journeys. Okay, was it difficult to write without over-intellectualizing? Not at all. I think that one of my skills is that I am not as intelligent as I sound. So no, I think that, joking aside, that I'd like to think that I'm good at explaining intricate concepts in a simple manner. So it wasn't hard to write it in that kind of tone. I have read some other books by forensic psychiatrists that have come out recently, And I don't want to spark any beef, but in my view, some of them have been quite formal, quite stuffy, and have read like textbooks. Mine, in my opinion, doesn't read like that at all. It's kind of more storytelling than it is. And obviously I talk about psychiatric illnesses, I talk about mental health act, but it isn't supposed to be a lecture. It's not supposed to be to fill you full of information, because you don't need to know that kind of stuff. I do when I give evidence in court, you don't. What I focused on is what I think is the interesting bits, what I think readers want to hear, just like viewers want to see, is the actual stories of the individuals. So to answer the question in a long rambling way, it's not difficult to write it without over-intellectualizing. What are my aspirations? Just to kind of share my stories. I think that I've learned from doing this job that people are very interested in the types of people that I see, people with mental illnesses who've committed very serious or bizarre crimes, like Ralph Riley. So yeah, just to tell my story, I'm trying to break into the media, so if I'm being honest, I suppose I'm profiting in a way by expanding my media profile. I think that's only fair that I'm doing that. I don't think I'm going to make a ton of money from it, especially considering the amount of time it took me to write the book. I don't think it's financially that profitable, but that's fine. That's never been my goal from day one. To guide us in our own possibly related journeys, I mean, with respect, I don't think I'm going to be guiding that many people, because I don't think that many people out there have severe mental illnesses and have been charged with a very serious crime like a murder that will be reading my book. If you are in that situation, then I hope I can help, but I think that's going to be a very, very, very small proportion. Okay, I'm going to get back to the book, then more questions, and then we'll end this thing. Okay, so basically, I realized that there was a risk here that, depending on the outcome of my assessment, if I said that I thought Ralph was mentally unwell, which clearly he was, then he could strike by flooding the internet and making all these kind of pamphlets and leaflets about me, basically trolling me, but in real life, like he did with the other doctors. So I decided I had no option but to contact Judge Whittaker directly to warn her of the imminent threat. A little part of me was tempted to suggest that the judge should remand Ralph to prison instead of letting him be on bail, and perhaps even arresting his father on a charge related to threatening behaviour. However, the judge had a robust and fairer plan. She made some very strict, clear bail conditions, which Ralph had to sign off on, saying that he was specifically prohibited to make any form of contact with myself or the judge. And if he broke this, or if anybody broke this, then he'd be immediately arrested, incarcerated. That included any literature, anything from their website, any menacing leaflets. And so that was the bail conditions. And I think it must have worked, as I didn't hear a peep from either of them, much to my relief. I heard from the solicitors that Ralph was later transferred to a psychiatric unit, which was also one of the recommendations that I made in my report. And I imagine he would have been quite a handful for the unfortunate forensic psychiatrist who had to treat him, because delusional disorder is notoriously difficult to treat, and it responds far less successfully to antipsychotics than its cousin diagnoses like schizophrenia. And also a lack of insight and reluctance to engage in therapy is fairly standard for mentally disordered offenders sent for rehabilitation in these units, but this kind of hatred and vitriol and disdain towards doctors and the medical profession and psychiatrists is quite rare. And then I said in my book, I won't go into too much detail now, but I'm minded that occasionally forensic psychiatrists can be the victim of disgruntled patients. So as an example, in May and June 2018, a spree killer sought out and fatally shot 6 people dead in Scottsdale, Arizona in the States. And he was a 56-year-old man called Dwight Lamont Jones. And one of his victims was a 59-year-old Dr. Stephen Pitt, who was a well-known forensic psychiatrist who had examined him recently. So I guess my lesson from all of this is that I have to take these things seriously, and you can't be too casual and about risks and threat. You have to take them seriously. Okay, so that was an overview of the chapter of my book. Go and cop it, it's going to be dope. Right, let's get back to these questions, only a couple more. Actually, the next question is kind of very much connected to what I've just been reading out, and it's by Aisha Nadeem, who said, have you ever felt intimidated / uncomfortable with anybody you've assessed? If so, how did you deal with this? Well, this was a prime example of somebody that I felt intimidated by, not physically, but in terms of their ability, my reputation being damaged by their actions. So that's how I dealt with that. I've also been punched in the face in my career. It's actually happened twice, but I've written about one time in my book. And well, I'll let you read it, but basically I didn't really get to deal with it because it happened so suddenly and so unexpectedly that there was no build-up, so there was very little that I could have done to prevent it, and it happened so quickly I didn't really have time to react to it afterwards. In terms of my career in general, generally, much to possibly your surprise, I don't feel that threatened generally, because when I'm doing my assessments, mostly defendants are on their best behaviours, and when I see them in prisons, if they are risky, or even in psychiatric units, they will have nursing staff around. There are safety measures like holding your alarms, and I guess, I don't know, I don't feel that frightened. I'm a big boy, I can handle myself. I don't generally feel threat from people. Okay, last question. How do you share people's experience and personal info? Do you seek their permission to not breach confidentiality, or simply change personal details? Will the book be available on Audible? Yes, the book will be available on Audible. Now, I will admit that I've not sought the permission from the people that I've talked about in my book. The reason being is because I can't talk about live cases, so all of the patients I've discussed are historical. So I've not seen them for 2 or 3 years, some of them even longer, sometimes 5, 10 years. So I don't actually physically know where they are. Plus, a lot of them I've seen as one-off assessments, so it's not like I have a paper trail of knowing where they are. However, I've made very, very sure to hide their identities. So I've changed their names, I've changed some logistic details like where they're from. Occasionally I've changed males to females and vice versa. So I've made them less identifiable. I have checked with my indemnity people, so as far as I know, I'm not going to get sued. I think in an ideal world, I would want to speak to them personally, but as I say, I've not been their treating psychiatrist for months or years, which is sometimes a psychiatric dynamic. Instead, I have only seen them as one-off assessments as an expert witness for court. Okay, so you've heard from my book. You've heard me answer some questions. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for listening. Just very quickly, I'm going to give you an overview of this channel in case you're new to this. So it's called A Psych for Sore Minds. I'm a consultant forensic psychiatrist. I address videos that tackle a whole range of issues related to either mental illness or offending, or the crossover between the two. Recently, I've done a video about autism and if it's overdiagnosed. I've talked about whether suicide is selfish, so the pros for that argument, the cons for that argument, and my opinion. I've done some high-profile cases like Catherine Knight, first Australian woman to receive a life sentence in prison, full-term life sentence, because she, and I kid you not, she killed and beheaded her husband, and she tried to feed her husband's head to her husband's kids. Pretty shocking case. I do my own psychoanalysis of that. So if you're interested in true crime or mental illness, you've got to check it out. Okay, that's enough rambling for me. Got to keep it moving. I ain't got no time for shucking and jiving. I hope you buy the book, and if not, I hope to see you on my channel soon. Stay euthymic, and whatever happens, do not forget. I love you.